What happens to a voice when the world quiets down? What becomes of a man who once filled stadiums with songs that made strangers cry, when suddenly the cheering stops? At 85 years old, Bill Anderson, known to millions as Whisperin Bill, doesn't walk out to roaring crowds or flashing cameras anymore. Instead, he walks across the creaking floors of a quiet Tennessee home, humming half-finished lyrics only the walls will hear. This is not the story of an ending, but of a legacy, of a man who once stood in the center of country music's golden era and now sits by a window watching the sun set across the Nashville hills, still shaping music in ways the world doesn't see. Gone are the tour buses, the endless highways, the buzzing backstage chaos. In their place, a kitchen table covered in notebooks, pages stained with coffee rings, lyrics scribbled in shaky handwriting that still carry the weight of poetry. On some afternoons, if you listen closely enough, you'll hear that soft, familiar hum, the whisper of a voice that carried love, heartbreak, and hope across decades. Bill Anderson's story is one of contrasts. The boy from South Carolina who found his way to the Grand Ole Opry, the shy songwriter whose soft voice became his greatest weapon, the country star who never chased the wild scandals of fame, yet somehow outlasted nearly all of his peers, and now the old man who seems to live in silence, even while his music still echoes everywhere. But to understand why Bill Anderson matters, why his presence still lingers in Nashville like a steady heartbeat, we have to go back to the beginning, to the boy who never quite fit the mold of the loud, wild, boot-stomping country singers of his day, and yet somehow created a sound that could break your heart with just a whisper. The year was 1958. A young man sat alone in a tiny room, guitar across his lap, notebook open, pen tapping against the page. He didn't look like someone destined to stand on the Opry stage. He didn't sing like the booming voices dominating the charts. But he had words, gentle words, honest words, words that painted love, not as fireworks, but as fragile, fleeting things you held onto for as long as you could. And when he finally stepped onto that stage, nervous and unassuming, something unexpected happened. The audience didn't need loudness. They didn't need fireworks. They leaned in, hushed, and they listened. That night, Whisperin Bill was born. Now, decades later, when Bill sits alone in his home, surrounded by awards that gather more dust than he does, attention, he smiles, because he knows the secret. The whispers lasted longer than the shouts. Bill Anderson's beginnings were far from glamorous. Long before his name appeared in neon lights or on the Opry billboards, he was just another Southern boy with a dream too big for the small towns he grew up in. He was born in Columbia, South Carolina. In 1937, a Depression-era child raised on simplicity and Sunday hymns. He wasn't the loudest in the church choir. He wasn't the boy showing off in school talent shows. In fact, if you'd asked his neighbors back then, they might have said Bill was too quiet, too shy, too soft to ever command a stage. But what nobody knew was that his quietness wasn't weakness. It was power, the kind that listened, absorbed, and turned life into words. At 19, while his classmates chased careers in business or medicine, Bill sat alone with his guitar, scratching out verses that felt too raw, too fragile to ever make it on the radio. Songs were like secrets, he once said, things you write down because you can't say them out loud. By the late 1950s, he was sending demos to Nashville, each one dismissed politely, if not ignored entirely. They said his voice wasn't strong enough. They said country music needed men who sounded like cowboys, not poets. But Bill refused to change. He kept whispering when the world wanted shouting. And slowly the world began to lean in. The turning point came with a song called City Lights. It was written in the dim glow of a hotel room while Bill worked as a young radio DJ. He didn't have money, he didn't have connections. All he had was a guitar and a head full of stories. But when Ray Price, one of country's giants, recorded that song in 1958, it shot to #1, and suddenly the boy with the soft voice wasn't so invisible anymore. Imagine it, a kid barely out of college, walking into a Nashville that didn't yet believe in him, only to hear his words pouring out of jukeboxes and radios across America. It was the moment when Bill realized something that would define his entire career. You don't have to be the loudest to be heard. From there, the 1960s opened wide for him. He joined the Grand Ole Opry in 1961, the sacred stage of country music. But while other artists filled the room with booming twang and fiery energy, Bill stood still. He closed his eyes. He whispered. And the audience, thousands strong, held their breath so they wouldn't miss a word. They called him Whisperin Bill at first, half mockingly. But soon, it became a badge of honor. His soft voice wasn't just his trademark. It was his rebellion. In an industry that often mistook volume for emotion, Bill showed that a whisper could break hearts louder than any shout. Now, decades later, sitting in his Tennessee home, Bill looks back at those days with a quiet smile. The trophies and plaques on his shelves don't gleam the way they used to. But he doesn't need them to. For him, the real reward was simpler, knowing that his songs, those fragile words, scribbled in hotel rooms and late-night kitchens, outlived the flashing lights. And perhaps that's why today, at 85, he still writes, not for fame, not for charts, but because words have always been his way of staying alive. By the late 1970s, country music had shifted. The honky-tonk grit was giving way to polished, radio-friendly sounds. New stars rose like wildfire, their cowboy hats taller, their boots shinier, their songs slicker. And for a while, it seemed like the quiet voice of Whisperin Bill was fading into the background. It was a strange thing for a man who had lived his whole life by words to suddenly find the world not listening. His records charted lower. His tours drew fewer crowds, and whispers not the kind he built his career on, but the ones spoken in back rooms of record labels began circulating. Maybe Bill's time is over. And yet, Bill never stopped writing. He couldn't. If singing had built his name, songwriting had built his soul. And in that silence of fading fame, his pen became sharper. It was during this era that Bill's greatest strength revealed itself: reinvention. While many artists struggled against the changing tide, Bill leaned into it. If his voice wasn't climbing the charts, maybe his words still could. And so he became, almost quietly, one of Nashville's most trusted songwriters. When newer artists, hungry but untested, came to town, it was often Bill they sought. His home became a kind of workshop, a temple for storytelling. On his worn-out table sat stacks of lyrics, coffee cups half full, and a pen that seemed to never stop moving, and one by one, songs carrying his fingerprints found their way back onto the charts, sung by others, but born from the whisper of his mind. But let's not pretend it was easy. There were nights of doubt. Nights when the applause he once lived on was replaced by silence. Nights when he'd walk off the Opry stage and wonder if the audience had come for him, or simply out of habit. Bill later admitted, "I had to ask myself, do I love being famous, or do I love writing? And if the fame goes, will the writing be enough?" The answer, of course, was yes. Writing was always enough. By the 1990s, Nashville had changed again. Garth Brooks was filling stadiums. Country had gone mainstream. But amid the pyrotechnics and booming choruses, the industry remembered something. Songs still mattered. And suddenly, Bill Anderson, the man once dismissed for being too quiet, was back in demand. His pen birthed hits for Kenny Chesney, Brad Paisley, Vince Gill, and George Strait. The younger generation of stars, kids who grew up hearing his name, whispered on their parents' radios, now came knocking at his door. Imagine that, a man in his 50s, his so-called best years behind him, now finding himself in the thick of Nashville's future. And here's where the beauty lies. Bill didn't just write for them, he wrote with them. He sat in rooms with artists half his age, listening more than speaking, guiding without lecturing. And what came out of those sessions were songs that bridged generations. Brad Paisley once said, "Writing with Bill is like writing with history. You feel like you're touching the roots of country music itself, and isn't that something?" To go from being doubted as a boy to being the very standard against which others measure themselves, even as his career reignited. Tragedy found its way into his personal life. Bill endured heartbreaks, divorces, and the inevitable loneliness that comes when the spotlight dims. But through it all, his pen remained faithful. When he couldn't say what hurt, he wrote it. When he couldn't carry the weight of silence, he sang it. And slowly, the world remembered Whisperin Bill was more than a relic of the past. He was the living proof that country music isn't about noise, or fame, or flash. It's about stories, and no one told them better by the 2000s. Bill Anderson had become something rare in country music, a bridge. A bridge between the dusty old honky-tonks and the glossy stadium tours. A bridge between fiddles and steel guitars and electric guitars that could shake an arena. And most importantly, a bridge between generations. The Country Music Hall of Fame, called the Grand Ole Opry, never let go. And young artists, kids barely old enough to know his early hits, began seeking him out as both a mentor and a collaborator. It wasn't unusual to see a 20-something singer nervously knock on the door of Bill's quiet Nashville home, clutching half-written lyrics, only to leave hours later with a finished song and a story about how Whisperin Bill himself had helped them find their voice. By now, Bill was no longer chasing charts. He didn't need to. He had already climbed them. What he chased instead was meaning. At 70, at 75, even now at 85. The routine barely changed. Coffee in the morning, pen to paper, words flowing not for fame, but because they had to. Bill once said in an interview, "I don't think I'll ever retire. When you love what you do, retirement feels like giving up, and I've never been good at that." But what about the man behind the legend? The Bill away from the stage lights. He chose simplicity. While many of his peers spent fortunes on sprawling estates and flashy toys, Bill's pride was quieter. Handwritten lyrics, family photos, and the little reminders of a life lived fully. Neighbors would see him walking the same Nashville streets he once sang about, humming softly to himself. Friends described him as generous to a fault, always quick with a laugh, always ready with a story. And those stories, well, they weren't just for the stage anymore. They were for his grandchildren, for fans at intimate gatherings, for anyone who cared enough to ask, "Bill, what was it like?" Even as time carved its lines into his face and thinned his whispery voice, the spirit never dimmed. When younger singers trembled before stepping onto the Opry stage, it was often Bill who'd put a hand on their shoulder and say, "Just tell the truth in your song, that's all that matters." And isn't that the heart of it? Truth, not volume, not fame. Truth. At 85 Whisperin, Bill Anderson lives far from the roaring crowds and flashing lights. His home sits just outside Nashville, peaceful, warm, filled not with trophies, but with memories. On his table, notebooks stacked high, some songs finished, some waiting. The whisper still flows, as steady as ever, and in that quiet, he embodies the very thing his career proved over and over again. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to dazzle to leave a mark. Sometimes, a whisper is enough to echo through generations. When country fans talk about Bill Anderson now, they don't just speak of the songs he sang, or even the ones he wrote. They speak of his presence, his patience, his humility, and his belief that music could still heal, connect, and endure. And so we return to that image, the legend in his quiet home. No spotlight, no stage, no crowd, just a man with a pen, still whispering, still writing, still shaping country music, even if the world doesn't always notice, because that's who he is. That's who he's always been, Whisperin Bill. And so, at 85, Bill Anderson proved something the world often forgets. Fame may fade, crowds may quiet, but legacy whispers on. His songs are still sung, his words still carry weight, and his presence still inspires. Because greatness isn't always found in the spotlight. Sometimes it's found in the quiet, in the whisper, in the life of a man who never stopped creating. If Bill's journey touched you, if his resilience and humility reminded you that true success is measured not in applause but in impact, then carry that whisper with you, and don't let it fade. More powerful stories like this. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and explore the playlists linked below. Because every legend has a story, and sometimes it's the quietest voices that speak the loudest.